Well, I have 10 o'clock and it looks like the trickle has slowed, so I'm sure people will continue to join us here. But welcome everyone to the third day of Practical Farmers of Iowa's virtual annual conference, and to this session discussing carbon markets and what farmers really need to know. So my name is Jorgen Rose, Habitat and Policy Coordinator for PFI, and I'll be moderating this session for our featured speakers, Dr. Michelle Wander and Crystal Zobish. We'll be together here for 60 minutes, followed by a 10-minute break before the next session begins. So during this presentation today, please use the chat box on the session webpage. So I'll be keeping an eye on that chat box and relaying questions to our speakers during Q&A at the end of each of their presentations. And I'd also like you all to take a minute and just introduce yourselves into the chat. Just your name and where you're from and where you live or farm would be great. If you see the poll button next to the chat, there's also a few poll questions in there that our speakers would like you to fill out, just so we get a sense of who's joining us today. So take a couple minutes and click over to that poll tab and fill out those polls on the session webpage. I also want to recommend that everyone use theater mode to view this session in the browser. We're finding that that view is a little better than the standard browser view, so you can find that theater mode button probably below your video feed. And you've probably heard this before if you've been attending sessions over the last couple of days, but please be mindful that we are a diverse group representing many perspectives and that we are communicating in a virtual space. Please be generous with your questions, respectful with your comments, and uphold PFI's core values of providing a welcoming space for everyone to learn and share about farming and agriculture. If you are a certified crop advisor, the QR code for 1 CEU credit is provided on this session page. If you're having trouble with those QR codes, please send us an email, info@practicalfarmers.org, and we can help you out. I know there have been some technical glitches. I also want to make a special note thanking our conference sponsors and exhibitors who have all helped make this conference a reality. So without further ado, I want to formally introduce Dr. Michelle Wander and Crystal Zobish. Michelle is a professor at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and with an interest in how standards, voluntary marketing, and decision support tools can encourage soil stewardship. Crystal is a climate policy associate with the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition and the Organic Farming Research Foundation. So I know that carbon markets and carbon sequestration are a big topic. We're going to probably cover just a small piece of all the information that is out there today, but I know that some of you have been participating in related sessions. So we'll go ahead and get started with Michelle. So Michelle, if you want to go ahead and pull up your slides, you can kick us off.
Okay. Make sure I get the right one. How does that look? Everybody see that and can hear?
Yep, looks good.
So, all right. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with PFI and talk about something that I've been working on for really my entire career. And I was remembering sort of little quotes that haunt me, and kind of to set up today's talk. I keep thinking about whether we let perfection get in the way of the good. And then I remember something that I believe was a quote from Dick Thompson, and I actually contacted my sister-in-law who hosted him at Ohio State when I was a grad student many years ago. And some of you might not know Dick Thompson, but he was one of the early founding farmers for PFI. And he said, the man who says it can't be done should never stand in the way of the man who's doing it. So those two are kind of in my mind today when I think about some of the discourse around carbon credits and sequestration. And I think there are technical, practical, and ethical questions that we want to consider. And this is a really large conversation ongoing. Oh, my thing is not wanting to advance. That's no good there. And so the carbon sequestration is part of a larger ecosystem services conversation and sustainability conversation, and the quantification of soil organic matter within this space is being, propelled by different funding avenues. But I'm kind of making the largest assumption that the reason that our sort of market-based approach of voluntary markets and the entry and we're as far as we've gotten is because of climate change and interested in using carbon sequestration as an offset. But in this landscape, there are lots of issues and lots of shoes that are going to drop. And so this is going to be a moving target, I think, with people who are hopefully really sort of in the spirit of continuous improvement. We have lots of different analysis of tools and a legacy of approaches and information that we are drawing upon, trying to really get it right. And by far the hardest space to get it right on, to get an accurate report out of whether you actually sequestered carbon would be on a specific farm location. So I have here in this picture something that maybe was meant to prompt questions from you. On the left, I have a sort of cartoon of a process model. We've been working with the parameterized version of the Sentry model that lets us quantify uncertainty and calibrate coefficients and maybe make it a little easier, but that sort of is only as good as the data we put into it. And we've been driven by the Kyoto Accords from an initial framework that had from to coefficients, like if you adopted no-till, you would sequester at a rate, and they had one value for everywhere. Now we're at the national scale trying to use data, and we're struggling to get quality data even at a county scale. And sort of these generic comparisons is, sort of there are modeling issues, and we could talk about modeling issues. In the middle with the blue and the green sort of spreadsheets, those were the input spreadsheets that you would use for enrollment and conservation and stewardship program at one point. That's an evolving program. And there's a lot of influence between our federal approaches and our federal data and what's going to actually make it to the ground. But we have this sort of evolving global, national, and then localized approach that sort of a crosscut. And you see that LCA circle where we're trying to do cradle to grade quantification of the full life cycle impacts of either a product or a production unit. And so this sort of at the global scale and for international trade, whether you know it or not, there's a arrow through all of this for these large companies that produce and trade across these international boundaries. So UN protocols and ISO standards that establish that are really influencing things, even though our sort of domestic course has been fairly separate. So I've been really fascinated in this and really trying to get it right. And on this table or figure, I found an interesting paper that I thought was sort of helpful for us to think about some of the things. And I think that Crystal will get into more, but we have our Clean Air Act, and over the 20-year period, we floated carbon markets or tried to figure out how that would be done. And we've been in this conversation anticipating approaches and the relative cost benefit of strategy. So, we could have a regulatory framework, but people in agriculture really favor both voluntary standards, and the organic standard is a good example of one, or sort of product claims. And then in the middle where you see this persuasive strategy, I would say really in a way we have the sort of bribe strategy or payments through the federal government where you have to qualify with certain criteria to basically enter into that market, right? So to get conservation compliance payments, you have to adopt certain practices. So we have different things that would actually be used to validate or enforce or discover at different scales. And this sort of grand experiment that we're engaging in now with these voluntary markets has been in play for a while. And one of the things that's really influential and emerging, and we see sort of showing up, that's going to probably influence agriculture more and more, is as life cycle accounting improves, and it's not just out there as a reference, but actually starts to get required by agriculture. So agriculture was actually entered into the EPA's greenhouse gas registry, and there are data on different streams and some of the accounting in this sort of complicated figure. We have a lot of greenhouse gases that we're very worried about. Some of them are much more heat trapping, for example, the hydrofluorocarbons, and some of them for agriculture, like CO2, which would be tightly connected to carbon sequestration, is one of the best quantified and connected to ag. We have other things that are more difficult, and as we get better at it, are going to enter into agriculture's balance sheet, if you will, and start to be enforced. So, I think methane and nitrous oxide are kind of shoes to drop, and the sort of what is included in and boundaries. There's lots of tricky issues. So I'm not going to go at this at length. It's just to say that this sort of corporate value chain compliance standards, where people in agriculture, have protocols coming out, and these are hybrids of people drawing on our legacy of knowledge and agreements on what we should do. So, for the value chain, we have this, inclusion of different factors. And in many ways, the information that you could supply around your quote activity data to drive the emission factors would be very finely resolved and could be very field specific. So as a sort of issues where right now, when we're projecting agriculture using such and such a practice or such and such a farming system, where right now where we're having, you know, corn that's grown with no-till and producing for ethanol, really. And so I've been very involved in us trying to get good numbers on that. And in order to qualify as a you know, a defensible practice, we have a reference then. So we're comparing that to standard production of gasoline, you know, gas or certain criteria. So we're setting benchmarks and references and having kind of socio-technical negotiation of how it's going to be done. So for the business trying to actually participate in this has been very engaged in thinking about sort of where and how precision and accuracy have to meet to get it right. And if we're thinking that the consumers are the ones that are going to basically float this market and rather do it through participating through direct voluntary markets, you know, we're trying to retain, in my opinion, as a sort of servant of society, really get this right? And so, you know, we're really trying to let individual choice drive this. And I have some pictures of papers on the right where these are examples of this at the high policy level and that sort of high discourse that drives things that can have significant influence on winners and losers. And so people who are really publishing and working on this very, you know, I think some very, very sincerely and diligently are contributing. And so this is a moving target. And this is influencing what you're experiencing as an individual farmer. You know, so I myself happen to actually really be a Gemini. And so I really, you know, I can maybe blame it on that, but I go through very much a Jekyll and Hyde about whether this is really a good thing. And you know, we know that carbon sequestration is I guess I'm going to circle back to that, but you know, we know that this is a practice that we can adopt and it has many, many wonderful benefits. So this sort of hypothesis that if we incentivize it, we open markets, great for agriculture, and it's great for the consumer simultaneously. There are these concerns, and this private market approach has been attempted. You know, we've been in this experiment, and carbon sequestration and terrestrial sinks went on the Sydney Exchange, I think in 2005, right? So they went with a free market approach, and in many ways we can look to what happened there to try to improve what we're doing here, and that's the kind of thing that I do. You know, so people really worry about this bait and switch, you know, and so if we get this wrong, it's going to be terrible, but there is wide agreement that we really need to get it right. You know, and so this has been, actually, again, I'm going to, you know, to actually get the Kyoto Accords launched, the fight over whether terrestrial offsets were permissible was all about whether there'd be cheating. And so we still see this now, and some of, you know, the authors in these papers are friends of mine that, you know, really think that soil scientists are being literally, I've had friends call friends immoral, thinking that we were setting standards that we couldn't backstop. And in a way, they're being about precision. But, you know, some of these people, I think part of it is about the generalization and downscaling it. So this grand experiment to really do on-farm sequestration, you know, if you're in for the ride and you're really trying to do well, we can learn a lot from conservation programs and what has worked and what has not worked. And we've been in, we know a lot. And now whether we can put what we know into practice and not ignore lessons that we've known forever is really the question. So, you know, claims like this, that agriculture is the most advanced technology for addressing climate change, I think this would be an example of maybe a little bit of hyperbole, right? So this kind of overstatement, you know, makes the authors of the previous papers react with alarm. But it is, and it was agreed upon and allowed in the offsets because we know how to do it. We can adopt this practice very quickly. Actually, so this was 20 years ago where this claim was made, is if we can use agriculture for 25 years, we can save our butts, right? So we know that agriculture can sequester and we can buy time and slow the rate of increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere while we clean up industry. And so that's I think a key critique is that this will distract from the really serious business of cleaning up industry. So, but it is, for many reasons, really valuable to sequester carbon. I have pictures on the top where on the left we have people using what would be soil building practices that we know increase organic matter on the left and the right, where we know it has, and those are from organic and conventional comparisons in Europe on the top, and the Rodale Farming Systems trial on the bottom, where we have under very wet conditions that greater water entry, less erosion, and in the bottom we have greater water holding, greater yield stability. So these are known knowns that are a really good thing for agriculture, and also an example of where a lot of our data driving these comparative rates, the winner and the loser, or the better practice where we have side-by-side trials. I'm going to get into a minute sort of some of the issues and critiques that we can drive ourselves crazy about when we're trying to get a good number. So part of the, I guess, the issue there in the offsets, I could be measuring in the Rodale trial, for example, and this is on a slope, probably like a 3 or 4% slope, that the organic matter in the organic is always higher than it is in the conventional on the right. But both of them over time could be losing organic matter, and so due to erosion, right? So if I actually really needed to be banking carbon and keep it there, this comparison might be bad. So this sort of reference and the need to have comparison over a long time period to prove you're keeping it there has been one of the common critiques and demands. We can come back to sort of discussions about that. But this sort of known technologies and known in general, I think we can support this idea for sure. So some of these sticky issues, which I was just getting into, these side-by-side treatments are really the largest basis for our rates and our assurity. In life cycle analysis and lots of these things, we build in and we bury way too much in a label of a no-till conventional or organic. There are really so many details in there. So an organic system that's including a root crop, those are not going to have the potential to sequester carbon like one that's using livestock production and a large period of hay in them. So we really need the devil in the details, and these references in these labels for some of these things that would have been activity data, or the detail of if you're fall plowing or spring plowing, some of those details have to get in, and we have increasing capacity to get them in if you're willing to supply that level of detail. I already mentioned this change over time, or this true reference. There's also issues, and so for soil carbon sequestration, it's interesting because you're doing that in the field per area right now. Some people, and for lots of people, if they're going to try to load that onto a product, are going to want to do carbon sequestration per unit of calories or per, get it to the plate. So there's all kinds of interesting things where in all,
Oops. Well, we'll see if Michelle will rejoin us here in a minute. Looks like she's frozen. Well, Crystal, maybe we should jump to your presentation and we can come back for Michelle's last few slides.
Yeah, I think we lost Michelle.
Yeah, looks like we lost her. So maybe she'll rejoin. Seems like a connection issue, but
okay. Well, I'm happy to jump in. I hope Michelle doesn't feel freaked out when she comes back in.
Yeah, let's keep going.
All right. So, can everyone see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. So, Michelle has been talking more of the ins and outs behind the soil science piece of carbon sequestration, and we're going to take a little bit of a step back with my presentation, and I'm going to give like a brief introduction to the topic of carbon markets in general and ecosystem service markets more generally, covering some basics, definitions, and then I'm going to switch our focus to the legislative activity on the subject. I'm going to cover some prominent bills, give a brief history from the last time Congress considered comprehensive climate legislation, and close with some considerations and questions that you may all want to consider asking when reviewing a carbon market contract. And I also have a whole bunch of resources that you all can explore to learn more about the topic. So what do we mean by agricultural ecosystem services? So farmers and ranchers who are implementing climate stewardship practices like cover crops, resource conserving crop rotations, management intensive rotational grazing, and agroforestry, to name a few, provide multiple ecosystem services like carbon sequestration, improved air and water quality, soil and water conservation, nutrient and water use efficiency, and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But implementing these practices can have really hefty initial adoption costs. So this is where payments come in. And there are different ways to reward farmers and ranchers for providing ecosystem services. The first one is through direct payments. And this benefits farmers directly for implementing certain management practices. Federal conservation programs like the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, and the Conservation Stewardship Program, or CSP, are prime examples of that. But in the future, there could be a direct payment program that's specific for soil health and greenhouse gas emission reductions. The next type of payment is tax incentives. So these are typically in the form of easements, and they provide landowners with a tax break for the land that is to be conserved. These are typically audited by the IRS, and there's an intermediate group that's involved to make sure that the conservation easement is being upheld. However, this could also potentially be a tax credit for carbon sequestration and soils in the future. The next type of payment is through certification programs. So this is where producers are allowed to sell their products for a higher price for the ecosystem services being provided. So examples of this are like the USDA organic certification label and other labels like regenerative organic or grass-fed and things like that. And then the last type of payment that could be given is through ecosystem service markets. So this is a free market tool to create a marketplace for ecosystem service credits that can be bought and sold. And this is the area that's getting most of the attention right now and where we will be focusing today. So there are different factors that make up an ecosystem service. So we know that credits are being created, valued, and exchanged. There need to be buyers and sellers. There's typically a coordinating organization. The detrimental and beneficial environmental impacts need to be defined, as well as an assessment criteria. And there needs to be a verification process in place to ensure that there's an actual positive environmental impact. And we also have to have a process for determining the value. That's what's going to determine the price of the credits. So there are different types of ecosystem service markets, but because of the climate crisis, carbon markets have been the ones receiving a lot of the attention. Other types of ecosystem service markets include water quality and wetland restoration. But with many of these markets, questions arise as to whether there's a net benefit to society or just a private transaction with no benefit, or even, as is often the case with wetland trades, if there's a significant net loss. So as Michelle mentioned, folks are turning to agriculture for its climate mitigation potential through carbon sequestration in trees and soil, and to a smaller extent for methane reductions in rice fields and livestock production and manure management. There are two primary forms to set up a market, And these two are in existence in the US right now. The first one is cap and trade. This is where the government limits the amount of carbon an entity can pollute, requires polluters to pay a tax to the government to offset their emissions, and then credits are sold by the government or through an intermediary, or polluters can buy carbon credits on their own through a market of their choosing. So cap and trade programs exist in California and through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. In the California cap and trade program, since 2012, there have only been 2 agricultural offset protocols that have been approved, one for dairy digesters, and the other one is a rice methane reduction protocol. But the program has set difficult standards to create agricultural protocols, and there are also high transaction costs and relatively low carbon prices. And so all of those factors have meant that most farmers have been kept out of the California carbon market, with only digester credits being sold. The other type of market is a voluntary market, and this is where a company or a government is choosing to cap themselves to meet sustainability goals that they have set themselves. So 2 examples of this are the indigo ag market, which is an emerging carbon market that is focused on its Terraton initiative, which Michelle briefly talked about. And this initiative is seeking to sequester 1 trillion tons of carbon. They're focusing on using biotech in the form of microbial seed coating treatments to facilitate sequestration alongside providing consulting services. They just kicked off a 10-year pilot program. The other example is the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium. This is a group of big food and ag companies like McDonald's, General Mills, Bayer, American Farm Bureau, Cargill, and many others. They're working with the Noble Research Institute to deploy pilots in northern Texas, southern Oklahoma, and the Kansas rangeland and row crops. And they're hoping to expand to other regions, and they should start launching this year. And I just want to say that this isn't the first time that ecosystem service markets have been discussed. In the 2008 Farm Bill, the first ever ecosystem service market provision was included. This provision established the Office of Environmental Markets with the hopes of facilitating participation for farmers and ranchers and foresters in carbon markets. USDA was tasked with developing guidelines to measure ecosystem services, create protocols for reporting, and creating a registry to collect and record ecosystem service benefits. There is an emphasis on carbon markets, but the provision was written broadly to include all ecosystem services and not just carbon sequestration. The provision also directed USDA to create guidelines for third-party independent verifiers. And most of what the office has done to date has been research, reports, guidelines. So nothing really programmatic in nature, but I've included the link to the office if you are interested in checking out all the documents that that this particular office has produced. Another program that has been used to develop offset markets for carbon and other ecosystem services is the Conservation Innovation Grants Program, which is part of EQIP. It was created in the 2002 Farm Bill with NSEC support and input. And after the Obama administration came in 2008, the program started having a focus on environmental market trading. So here I've just included 3 examples of the first set of awards in 2009 with that particular emphasis in North Dakota, Washington State, and the Delta region. And STIG awards have continued to have this emphasis. So for a little bit of background on the legislative history on this topic, the last time we saw comprehensive climate legislation introduced in Congress was in 2009. when the American Clean Energy and Security Act of 2009 was passed in the House of Representatives. This bill sought to establish an economy-wide greenhouse gas cap and trade system with complementary measures. And it also allowed for 2 billion tons of carbon offset markets, which sparked a lot of questions on whether any of it would be verifiable as real, additional, permanent reductions. Under this particular bill, agriculture and forestry were not capped, so they were not part of that, like the cap side of a cap and trade system. And there was a special provision to reduce the economic impact of cap and trade on chemical fertilizer prices for farmers. On the carbon offset market side, agriculture had a major role with a 5-year credit for newly adopted carbon-friendly soil health or greenhouse gas emission reduction practices. The credits were fully transferable and were subject to a verification system to include accreditation processes and conflict of interest rules. And they were only applicable if the practices were instituted starting January 1st of 2009. Senator Stabenow of Michigan was the lead on the ag portion of the Senate climate bill, which was very similar to the House passed bill, but with some tweaks. However, that bill never made it out of the Senate. So turning to today, agriculture has been highlighted by the Biden-Harris administration as a critical partner in addressing the climate crisis. The centerpiece of the Biden climate plan from his campaign is to dramatically expand and fortify the conservation stewardship program. And later on, the Biden platform also said that the administration will seek to enable farmer and rancher participation in a new voluntary carbon market. However, we don't yet have any more details as to what the voluntary carbon market will look like or how they envision tying CSP to voluntary carbon markets, but those details I'm sure will be coming very, very soon. And now I just want to turn your attention quickly to 2 bills that were introduced last year. The first one is the Agriculture Resilience Act, which is the most comprehensive piece of legislation on climate and agriculture that was introduced last year. It focuses on 6 building blocks, which you can see here on the slide: improving soil health, increasing agricultural research, ensuring farmland is being preserved and that farming is a viable career, supporting transition to pasture-based livestock, promoting on-farm renewable energy, and reducing food loss and food waste. This particular bill prioritizes resilience over efficiency. It supports local and regional food systems, and it provides a roadmap to a just and resilient agri-food system. The bill does include a provision on ecosystem service markets, but the legislation seeks to ensure that market-based approaches are not favored over traditional approaches. So the provision that is included within the Agriculture Resilience Act is really focusing on setting up the infrastructure that needs to be in place for a carbon market to operate. So it would direct USDA to establish a soil health and greenhouse gas advisory committee to evaluate existing outcomes-based measurement systems, to create an inventory of soil health and greenhouse gas emissions, and to establish criteria for payments, credits, and other incentives. The ARA is being expanded, and it will hopefully be reintroduced in March of this year. And last year, it was only introduced in the House of Representatives, but this year we're hoping to have a Senate companion bill as well. The next bill that I want to turn your attention to is the Growing Climate Solutions Act. It was introduced last year in both the House and the Senate, and Senator Stabenow led introduction in the Senate. This bill directs USDA to collect private industry protocols for carbon markets and approve them for the public. It allows technical assistance providers and third-party verifiers to self-certify with USDA and to be listed on a website for farmers and ranchers to use if they're interested in carbon credits. the legislation as it is written right now has USDA's role being very minimal, and there aren't provisions for an accreditation process. So basically, all of the accreditation would be done by the technical service providers in the company. So they would be allowed to do consultation, enrollment, and verification, just given the way that the legislation was written and introduced last year. This piece of legislation has gained broad support from major farm and environmental groups. And as you all know, Senator Stabenow is the new chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee and has expressed her commitment to establishing a carbon market for farmers as a priority for this year. This is all to say that as things stand right now, there aren't any universal standards, regulation, and verification in place across the carbon market space. This presentation has covered some proposals in the policy landscape, but the Agriculture Resilience Act and the Growing Climate Solutions Act have not been reintroduced in this Congress and are not close to becoming law anytime soon. Additionally, environmental justice groups, some scientists and advocacy groups that represent small and mid-sized farmers have raised some concerns around carbon markets. And so for a carbon market to trade legitimate credits, there need to be certain requirements. Permanence is one of them. So this requires that the carbon sequestered is permanent. And this is reflected in many contracts with landowners. Contracts tend to be, over 10 years. Some of them are over 50 years. And this presents problems for those who are leasing property or who are not passing on their land. Furthermore, weather events can destroy carbon stocks. And this is something that is particularly key to keep in mind as we continue to experience more dramatic weather events as climate change worsens. Another aspect is additionality. So the carbon must be new. This means that all of those farmers and ranchers who have already adopted climate stewardship practices are not going to be eligible for payments. In some cases, additionality prevents landowners receiving payments for other ecosystem services from NRCS as well. And then there are also issues with measurement uncertainty, like what's the bulk density in organic matter. It could be different at different times of the year. What's the testing depth? Remote sensing and modeling provide estimates, but they're not accurate enough for a carbon market to really function. And there have been some errors with remote sensing and modeling as well. So another question is geography. Carbon sequestration potential is very different all across the country, across different soil types, climates. So should all the areas be held to the same standards? Michelle also raised the next point around greenwashing, companies putting a spin and then getting a benefit from marketing themselves to customers. So carbon sequestration is very nuanced, and it could take a long time to develop these carbon stocks depending on several factors. So we just want to make sure that this isn't being used as a marketing trap by big companies without actually resulting in significant mitigation, right? And then there's also the question of data control and privacy. So one reason companies are interested in carbon markets is to mine farmer data to help them develop new products and services. So there are a lot of questions that arise over who controls the data and who benefits from it. And so these are just some considerations to take into account. Is the program stable? We've seen examples like the Chicago Climate Exchange that collapsed because the price for carbon dropped to a nickel, and there were just too many sellers and not enough buyers. Is there clarity around the required practices and the verification processes? How many samples are going to be taken? To what depth? When? Is there cost transparency? How much is monitoring going to cost? the practice implementation or environmental improvement, like how is that being measured? The return on investment. How long is a farmer going to have to wait to see a return, for creating these carbon credits? And the aggregation, like, can these be aggregated? Can a co-op or a watershed alliance enter a market together and distribute payments equally across members, or not? So, and lastly, there are a lot of questions that you could all be asking when considering a carbon market proposal, but there are things like, how much money will I receive for these payments? Who's verifying the practices and the carbon sequestration? Who gets access to the farmland for verification? And what will happen to the data collected on my farm? So this presentation is going to be posted, and I'll let you all read the remainder of the questions. And then I just want to point out that, again, like, this is going to be posted on the platform, and there are a ton of resources for you all to continue learning about this topic, including legal resources, webinar series, and there's one upcoming on February 12th, which focuses specifically on Midwest farmers. So, and that one will actually go through the different options of, like, Indigo, Nori, Ecosystem Service Market Consortium. So I encourage you all to take a look at all of these resources, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Great, thank you, Crystal. And we have lots of questions in the chat, and Michelle's back with us. So Michelle, I think if you're ready, I might just throw you some questions here from the chat. I'm sorry your presentation got cut short.
Okay, well, and maybe, is it okay if in response to questions I can pull, there were 2 or 3 questions or slides I put in based on questions that Jasmine Dillon got yesterday about sampling, and they're kind of to sort of the very well-known knowns about issues that go with things that Crystal said about sampling that we know, but people don't want to actually comply with. And so they're kind of, we keep banging our head on them.
Yeah, so I think if we come to questions, feel free to pull up any slides you think would be good. So I just want to make a note here. I mean, Michelle just referenced this session that we had yesterday. The recording of that session is available. I'm going to paste it into the chat here. And if you have questions, especially about livestock and grazing and carbon sequestration, I really encourage you to check out that session. I don't think we're going to be able to get into some of those details during our Q&A today. So Jay asked a question a few minutes ago about kind of social justice, and Crystal, you just kind of touched on this. And Jay's question is, with income inequality and poverty, economic vulnerability so high and increasing, how can we possibly rely on individual choice by consumers to support carbon markets? So I think that speaks to some of that environmental justice, but also maybe the stability of those markets. Crystal, I don't know if you can speak to either of those points a little bit.
Yeah, I can start, and I'd also be curious to hear Michelle's thought on this. It is really hard, right, to put sort of the onus on individuals to make the right choice. And I think that, that's why, like, NSEC is really excited about the Agriculture Resilience Act, because it's a bill that's providing a roadmap and a framework for how to transition to more sustainable agriculture production systems. And one thing that I didn't mention through the presentation, but something that we've heard from carbon market proponents, is that carbon markets are really designed to work for the largest farms, which means that those small scale and mid-sized farms and, like, diversified farms and organic farms are going to be at might be at a disadvantage based on what we've heard from different companies. So in terms of, environmental justice and social justice elements, it might not be that carbon markets are the solution for those particular issues. And that's where policy really needs to step in, right? There can't be like a one size fits all solution to these issues. So Those are some thoughts.
Michelle, any
I mean,
thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, and it's interesting, Crystal, you working with the organic industry as well. I've done a lot with organic and looked at the sort of the standard and the efficacy over time, because it's an interesting standard, because compared to what we're talking about here and where we might go with life cycle assessment, it's a really light standard, much lower lift, even though it is still burdensome, right? So looking at that, and what people want in aspirational standards, and I think, speaking to a group members of PFI, I think, people are here because you are, I think many people are aspirational in their farming practices, and carbon and organic matter in the organic standard, and lots of the sort of socially driven farming systems like in permaculture and regenerative ag, it's a proxy for lots of other things. So the wildlife benefits, and so land cover and land practices is so vitally important. So the carbon markets can't capture that, but this is where we'll have competing brands. And some of the questions that were asked yesterday about, how do you talk to your customer and what do you include? So I think these are really important questions, for us to make sure we're trying to be honest and we have honest brokers. And so this question for me about the role that different people play, and the role, for example, of government. We can see, and we've seen them try to support local agriculture or small business agriculture, and sort of that aspiration with some of their recent response to the COVID crisis. Mm-hmm. And so I think we can lower the bar for some. We can also, and a presumption in lots of the language for these sort of market-based approaches is to somehow make it owned by the location. And so if it, depending on how local it is, and this was tried in Australia and in New Zealand with their open market approach, where they went in and they had soil health indicators, and it's really quite an interesting role model for us to look at, and looking at what individual landholders valued, and sort of those methods in ecosystem service valuation are fascinating and really important for us to follow to answer your question. So, I think the values part is huge, and so your question's spot on.
Matt Liebman made a comment in the chat I just want to share. He says it's quite difficult to sequester a lot of carbon in black prairie soils, mollisols, but extended rotations and crop livestock integration strategies that reduce tillage and reduce use of N fertilizer can greatly decrease consumption of fossil fuels, and substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that's a good point. Michelle, if you want to talk a little bit about, reducing emissions versus, actually sequestering carbon, putting carbon back in the ground. I think those two things get maybe a little conflated or confused.
Right. And also, I think Matt's, hi Matt, point about certain people, and I think a comment that Jasmine made yesterday, where someone said they had a lot of clay in their soil. And so she said, well, you're in a good shape. Well, they're in good shape to keep the carbon, but like Matt said, they might already not have as much potential to add more. And this really, soils reach equilibrium, and this expectation that agriculture could be a contributor in the carbon sequestration part, it is definitely a short-term option, and that we could kind of use to get all the other ecosystem services. So Matt knows this, in his ground, they can have benefits, but once they're there, it really is, and Jasmine made this point too, it's the input part and the nitrogen part of this. So if you can, and nitrogen is one of the biggest, difficult things for us to manage well. And in agriculture, even though we're only about 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions from ag, the nitrous oxide emissions from soils is huge, and nitrous oxide and our need to reduce fertilizer, that's not yet in most of our accounting tools, but we're working on it hard. And I actually was looking at the protocol for the teraton, which is a blended sample and modeling and uncertainty, and it sort of is good, I think is very good stuff informed by remote sensing. They are tracking inputs. So when we do a national scale and we're trying to match fertilizer sales with averages that USDA uses, we know that we're applying more and really getting at reducing that. And some of this sort of precision and getting policy and people rewarded, if you're willing to share your data on that, that's a big one, and that kind of for leaching, all that stuff for our guesstimation. And Crystal, your thing about aggregating is a really interesting thing. And on the original attempt at our carbon market to guarantee and accommodate things like weather, and they sort of over enrolled to ensure they could supply the quantity delivered. And if you nested that inside a watershed, you could possibly get at some interesting things, but some things we really don't understand. So I think right now with our nutrient loss reduction efforts in Illinois, where we have sort of stacked these farmers enrolled and trying to share their data and adopt best practices to sequester carbon, and we can actually put them on top of watershed data, and they often have tile drainage. We don't see nitrogen levels coming down like we would expect or meeting targets. So some of these things, in terms of good actors getting rewarded, and this is again where Crystal was talking about, do we reward the practice, and you reducing your nitrogen and adopting the practice, or do we actually prove that you did it, right? And if we have to prove that you did it and you can't, are you going to get in trouble, right? And so that's really where I think where our nutrient loss reduction in nitrogen, we aren't going to make our targets at all.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple questions in the chat here about some of these voluntary markets. So someone has mentioned Indigo Ag, and kind of about the business model of these companies that are kind of in this business. Crystal, I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit. Like, what's the theoretical framework here for these companies who seem to be really pushing some of these carbon market systems?
Yeah, I can't speak to like all of them, but I can say that at least some of them, I think a lot of the value that some of these companies see in carbon markets is really more around the data that they're going to be able to collect and then analyze and use to push either services or products. And that's one big red flag that has been raised by advocacy groups. Like, is this really about climate mitigation, or is this more like, is this trying to get these companies to sort of break into sort of like the agribusiness sector? Mm-hmm. So, and there's also been, some that give higher payments for using their biotech products, like Indigo Ag, for example. So there's also questions as to whether like the carbon market is being used more as like a way to get into the agricultural like product development side of things. And I think that's sort of like on the Indigo and the Nori side of things, but from like those companies that are looking to buy these carbon credits, I think it's easier for companies to buy the credits than to actually make changes in their operations, the way that they run their businesses to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's why there's been a lot of interest from those big companies to buy the credits.
Great. We have about 6-7 minutes left, so maybe just time for a couple more questions.
Could I talk about sampling, because of sort of some of the point yesterday someone was asking, and I also have worked with some of these grower groups, and just to do a good job and measure carbon sequestration with any reasonable fidelity, people absolutely have to sample at least to a foot deep. And I think a lot of people are still just going to 6 inches. And that's been proven over and over to be completely inadequate. And so I personally will go out of my way to try to refute anybody making claims using a 6-inch sample. And what Crystal said, bulk density, if you compare, for example, a conventional and a no-till, and you till and you loosen up the tilled sample and you went to 6 inches, you'd actually be sampling a smaller mass of soil. So then when you quantified the mass in the depth, you'd have sort of a real biasing against that. So if you're going to sample, and we know these things change relatively slowly, go at least to 6 inches, sample. You don't need to sample every year. And, we know carbon around, for example, if you were in corn and soybean, you have more carbon going in. When we have seasonal rotational dynamics. So find a stable point when the soil is consolidated. For example, after harvest, when the soil hasn't been fluffed up, if you have a lot of freezing and thawing, it might be very loose in the spring. So, fall might be a good time. And then do it consistently within a crop phase. And if you can take bulk density, which is difficult, you're going to need to use a larger diameter core.
And I just want to add to that like the type of testing that you're describing, Michelle, is still very expensive.
Very.
And so there are a lot of questions around carbon markets and just like the legitimacy of the credits being generated, because we can't do this type of testing that we need to be doing at a large scale. So a lot of a lot of existing voluntary carbon markets are relying on modeling, right, and remote sensing. But Nori is already running into issues as to like companies not wanting to buy their credits because they don't do soil testing, for example. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And it's also who's responsible for paying for that, right? And like how does that sort of like math into the total benefit that you get from implementing these practices, and then the value that you get from generating those credits and selling them. So another thing to keep in mind.
Thanks, Crystal. Thanks, Michelle. I think there's a question here or a comment from Jen that additionality is a real problem. It punishes innovators and good stewards. And so I know for a lot of the farmers I work with that are already doing some of these practices, additionality might be a problem. Gary then asks, is additionality ever negotiable, or is this something that farmers really need to keep an eye out for?
Yeah. Can I comment about this? Once we built up organic matter in the soil and we're getting those environmental benefits, we need to maintain those practices to keep it in place. So we have to really think about, are we renting the space or are we buying it? Because you could have this truly perverse incentive, and we've seen this with conservation programs over the years where the society puts a lot of money in and we've accrued organic matter or added environmental services, and then the practice is stopped and the damage, it can just be released. So a really demented, perverse consequence could be somebody getting a contract and then plowing it out basically, and then getting paid again, right? So the sort of durable sustainability or durable stewardship we have to really figure out. And that's not just a problem of additionality here, but it's fundamentally for our conservation programs, right? When corn prices go up, CRP goes out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say that the additionality issue is big for carbon markets, and different companies have different policies on that particular topic. Like some of them will allow you to go back 3 years and get credit for, or like X amount of years, and get credit for having already implemented the practices. But that calls into question as to whether the credits that are being generated are legitimate or not. Because for the credits to be legitimate, the carbon has to be additional. So I think the additionality concept in a market that is structured in the way that it should be is going to be key. And I agree with Michelle and with a lot of the comments that you all have posted. Like, NSEC very much believes that early adopters and innovators should not be penalized and should actually be rewarded for all of the work that they've been doing. And so, when we advocate for conservation programs on the Hill, we have that emphasis very much in mind, and that philosophy is what drives us wanting to have these conservation programs not penalize those early adopters, but really reward them. And that's, that was part of the what got the conservation stewardship program created in the first place. It was wanting to reward those early adopters and those who are wanting to continue conservation practices in the long term.
Great. Well, we do just have about 1 minute left. There are lots of questions that we didn't get to in the chat. I apologize for that. Maybe Crystal and Michelle, you can browse through that chat on the session webpage and make some notes or paste some resources. Luke asked specifically if there are any resources for climate change fighting management opportunities or conservation practices here in Iowa. I don't know if any of you have any resources like that, but we will post the slides to the session webpage this afternoon, so the attendees can download those slides. Any 10, 15-second closing thoughts, Crystal?
Well, I just want to say thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. And there are a ton of resources in the slides that Jorgen is going to post later today. I think most of the ones that I have included in there are sort of more national in scope, but there is at least one webinar that is very much Midwest focused. So I definitely encourage you all to check that out. In particular, if you have specific questions as to how Indigo Nori Ecosystem Service Market Consortium, like how all these different players compare and their different offerings, I highly recommend that you all check that one out. And thank you for all of your super thoughtful questions.
Michelle, any last minute thoughts, places where people might find additional resources?
I'm sure PFI has loads of them, and I think really you're Googling. I guess, was the question about jobs for climate fighting?
No, it was about, you know, what are the opportunities for conservation practices that might have climate change benefits?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think there are, I think new Farm Bill stuff coming out will be very interesting. And I think a lot of the information with the best practices that NRCS is promoting very much will, you know, be good places to look at. And in Iowa, I know you guys have lots of activity. I know Matt Lieben was on the line. So really, you know, Iowa State folks, you've got tons of options. In part, I think it's finding things that are economically suitable for your farming system. So since I don't know the way you're farming, I don't know who to point you to specifically. You know, you guys I know have a session coming up on agroforestry. So in many ways, it's going to be, your opportunities are going to vary based on your market and your farm.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and I would, again, really encourage people to check out the session from yesterday. I think that's going to have some more information about kind of specific practices and stuff in it, especially related to grazing and livestock. But we are out of time, so I'm going to let everybody go so they can get to the next session. Thank you again, Crystal and Michelle. And this recording should be available in the next hour and a half, and we'll get those slides up as soon as possible. Thanks, everybody.